Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into something that really turns everything we thought we knew about getting sick completely upside down. We're going to be breaking down Dr. Daniel Roytas' highly controversial book, Can You Catch a Cold? We'll neutrally explore his, quite frankly, disruptive perspective on what actually makes us ill. We'll look at medical history, alternative biological theories, and the very foundation of modern medicine. Whether you buy into his arguments or think they're totally out there, looking at this evidence is absolutely going to make you view your own body and the next time you get the sniffles in a totally different light. Let's get into it.
So, can you actually catch a cold? I mean, we all kind of take it for granted, right? Someone sneezes next to you on the train and bam, 2 days later, you're wrapped in a blanket reaching for the tissues. But Roytas asks a simple, literally paradigm-shifting question. Where is the definitive proof? He argues that while we accept contagion as just a basic fact of life, the actual controlled scientific evidence for human-to-human transmission of common respiratory illnesses is, well, surprisingly thin.
Section 1. The contagion question. Okay, let's dive into this by examining the universally accepted germ theory dogma. This is the bedrock of modern healthcare, right? The idea that invisible pathogens jump from person to person, invade our bodies, and cause illness. Well, Roytas' goal here is to really re-examine the primary literature. He wants us to look past the assumptions and ask if the actual contagion of these everyday illnesses has ever been definitively observed and proven under strict scientific conditions.
Section 2. Historical contagion experiments. To really understand his argument, we need to look back at some visceral historical anomalies. And to do that, Roytas takes us straight to one of the most frightening and heavily studied events in human history, the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic.
To understand how contagion was tested, we have to look at Dr. Milton Rosenau. He tried to force infection in healthy sailors during that deadly 1918 pandemic using some incredibly extreme methods. We are talking about having severely sick patients coughing directly into the faces of healthy volunteers. He was injecting the healthy folks with mucus harvested right from the sick and even transferring infected blood. Rosenau was literally testing the absolute limits of the contagion model, creating scenarios far more severe than anything you'd ever encounter in daily life. Now, what's really fascinating is the result of those extreme experiments. 0. Astonishingly, 0 healthy people became ill during Rosenau's 1918 trials. Not a single person caught the flu from these intense direct exposures. For Roytas, this is a massive red flag. He views this as a foundational failure to prove contagion. He points out that even at the absolute height of a deadly, highly infectious pandemic, human-to-human transmission could not be forced in a monitored laboratory setting. Wild, right?
Moving forward in time, Roytas brings us to the UK's Common Cold Unit. This place operated continuously from 1946 all the way to 1989. For decades, researchers at this facility literally spent their days dropping viral secretions directly into the noses of healthy volunteers in this relentless attempt to give them colds and study the resulting illness.
Yet, Roytas points out a massive variable in their decades of data. Often, over 50% of the people completely refuse to get sick, despite having the viral material directly inoculated into their nasal passages. And it gets even stranger. The researchers found that those who actually did eventually get sick often develop symptoms that completely mismatch the person who originally donated the sick mucus. For Roytas, this wild variability is a crucial piece of the puzzle. It suggests to him that the virus itself is not the sole or maybe even the primary driver of the illness.
Section 3. Terrain over germs. So, the really crucial point here is, if a physical bug jumping between people isn't the sole cause of our misery, what exactly is happening? Well, this is where Roytas shifts his focus from the seed, the pathogen, to the soil.
He strongly advocates for terrain theory. This is the concept that the body's internal environment, basically the soil, and external lifestyle factors matter significantly more than any pathogen or seed in causing symptoms. From this perspective, he argues that a cold isn't an attack by an external enemy at all. Actually, scratch that, it's more like a biological spring cleaning. It's a natural detoxification process dictated by your own internal environment when it needs to restore balance and clear out accumulated toxicity.
Now, I know exactly what you're thinking. If it isn't contagion, why do entire offices or entire households get sick at the exact same time? We've all seen a cold tear through a workplace. Well, Roytas attributes this to what he calls synchronicity. Rather than passing a bug, people sharing a space are exposed to the exact same environmental and psychological triggers. A whole office experiences the same sudden seasonal temperature drops, the same shifts in barometric pressure, or changes in atmospheric electricity and EMFs. Families share the exact same heavy holiday diets, and coworkers share the same emotional resonancy of a highly stressful deadline. Roytas argues these shared environmental triggers prompt our bodies to initiate that biological cleanup at the exact same time, which creates the incredibly powerful illusion of transmission.
Section 4. Questioning modern virology. Of course, to make this argument hold up today, Roytas has to address the elephant in the room, modern medical testing. How exactly does he explain the positive test results that doctors rely on every single day?
What's really interesting here is how Roytas fundamentally critiques the modern tools used to, quote-unquote, prove viral presence, specifically PCR tests. He argues that PCR testing doesn't actually detect a whole infectious virus that's capable of making you sick. Instead, he likens the PCR process to a photocopier. He claims it merely takes tiny, harmless snippets of endogenous genetic material, stuff made naturally by our own bodies, or regular cellular debris, and copies it exponentially, cycle after cycle, until it finally registers as a positive result.
Furthermore, he takes the highly controversial stance that viruses haven't even been isolated in the traditional pure sense that most of us imagine. He argues that virologists add a witch's brew of genetic material to unpurified human samples in a lab. By mixing in toxic materials and starving the cell cultures of vital nutrition, the cells predictably die. Roytas suggests that researchers mistakenly look at this toxic cell death and incorrectly conclude that a virus was present and caused the destruction.
Section 5. The mind-body connection. Let's move to our final theme and see how this builds into a fascinating psychological framework called German New Medicine, which Roytas uses to explain the true triggers of our illnesses.
Roytas introduces the concept of conflict shock. This theory posits that respiratory symptoms are directly triggered by a severe, unexpected emotional or psychological stressor in one's life. He uses vivid examples, like a stink conflict, perhaps a situation at work or in a relationship that metaphorically just stinks, or a territory threat, like the looming fear of losing your home or your job. These deep psychological shocks, he argues, translate directly into physical manifestations. In this psychobiological model, the timeline of being sick is completely flipped on its head. The actual physical symptoms of a cold, the coughing, the runny nose, the sheer exhaustion, only appear after the psychological stress is finally resolved. In Roytas' view, the symptoms are not the disease itself. Rather, they mark the body's natural healing phase, actively repairing the tissues that were altered while you were in a state of high stress.
Now, this brilliantly illustrates the core conflict of our entire explainer. Notice how radically these two paradigms differ. Germ theory sees the cause of illness as an external virus. Roytas views it as internal terrain and toxicity. Germ theory blames person-to-person transmission. Roytas points to simultaneous environmental and emotional triggers. Germ theory frames symptoms as a violent pathogen attack, while Roytas frames them as a necessary body cleanup. And finally, for prevention, the traditional model tells us to avoid sick people and rely on vaccines, whereas Roytas says the only true prevention is maintaining a clean, balanced internal terrain.
Which brings us to the profound conclusion of his book. By suggesting we stop living in a fear-based model of contagion, Roytas is shifting the responsibility back onto us. He argues that by focusing on our air quality, optimizing our nutrition, getting adequate sunlight, and deeply managing our psychological stress, we can prevent our bodies from ever needing to undergo these harsh detoxification processes. He leaves us with this empowering and provocative question. If we aren't at the mercy of invisible bugs catching a ride on the breeze, how much agency do we truly have over our health? If your illness is dictated by your own terrain, what are you going to do today to change your environment?